Okay, we're going to get started. Hopefully none of you were here last week because we did not schedule, and they tried to send out a text or an email or something, so hopefully you weren't here. 2 weeks ago, though, we started with the Gospel of Mark. I'm not going to do a review of the Gospel of Mark, but I'm going to do a review of sort of the intro to what we talked about. And so feel free to jump in with questions. Maybe in 2 weeks' time you've kind of had some thoughts bubble up and you have some questions, so feel free to jump in. I based the title of this and loosely the premise on a book by Gordon Lathrop, in which he calls it the Four Gospels on Sunday. It's a kind of double play on words. It's how they're read in Sunday gatherings, the Four Gospels on Sunday, but also what they say about Sunday worship stories in the Gospels. And I gave the example, of course, he's a Lutheran, so every week he would hear all four readings. So he's talking about how, like for instance, in that tradition where they have a lectionary, they're not going to read every passage in the Gospel of Mark or any of the Gospels. It's selective passages in the lectionary. But the second part is how, for instance, in Mark you have stories that happen in the house. Mark uses house stories, and they say, well, hey, what if that's code for the church? Because the church by that time was meeting in houses, and so it's kind of Mark's way of saying, wink, wink, here's a house story, but it's really about us as a church meeting in a house. So I took that idea and thought about what does it mean to read the four Gospels on 4 Mondays, not just because we meet on a Monday, but because we live in the world. You know how they'll say on Sunday, well, how are you going to live come Monday? That kind of thing. And so I wanted us to look at the four Gospels. If you don't know, these are the icons in our sanctuary under the pipes on both sides. You have to really pay attention to see them because they kind of wash out. They're not as contrasting as this, but these are the symbols in our sanctuary. They're hidden in a couple other things on the cross, on the stem of the chalice that's used at 11. So you can come and look at that sometime. But here's the two parts I'm doing. I want us to look at each gospel one at a time and not let the others into the party. So when we're reading Mark, we're just reading Mark. When we're reading Luke, like we will tonight, we're just reading Luke. And we're not letting them bleed in. And the other part is, well, what does the Gospel of Luke have to say about our everyday life in the world? So again, a little review. Very broad observations about all four of the Gospels. They're all anonymous. So why do we call the Gospel of Luke, Luke? Well, we got to call it something, and it is a tradition that goes back to the church fathers because they had this notion that surely these people who wrote this were disciples who watched all this happen. Well, no, that's not true. They were written a generation or more later, but they assigned these names, and it's a whole lot easier than when scholars try to not do that and say in the third gospel or in the first gospel, etc. And that's okay, but when you get around to using a pronoun, you don't know what to do, and so that's what we do. We assign them names and those creatures, right? So what's the creature for Luke? We're doing Luke tonight. It's got horns. It's an ox. Okay. All four were written at least a generation after the time of Jesus. In the case of Luke, like a generation and a half. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70, which was in response to an uprising by the Jews, that's the impetus for writing. What are we going to make of the world now that our beloved temple's destroyed? The Romans have not just occupied our land, but they have humiliated us, killed us. How are we going to respond? So let me tell you a story. And they tell those Jesus stories. Mark wrote first. We don't know exactly, but it's after 70. Luke and Matthew, sometime in the 80s, we have no clue which one was first. There's different views, theories, but they're just theories. So I just chose to do Luke and then do Matthew. But we know that John came last. Paul's letters, and this is where it gets a little confusing, they were written in the 50s and 60s. So Paul writes before there's any such thing as a gospel, which is kind of weird. You know, you just would think, well, surely he's read Mark or he's read Luke. He's never heard of them, right? There's no such thing. But those stories from the 30s are circulating all the time. And in that oral culture, they're really good at memory. Like Carla today said, she's lost her notebook. Well, she regained it. She found it. But her notebook had all these notes in it. She goes, I wonder what I could remember. Well, people who write don't remember as well as an oral culture. So they had these storytellers that would go around doing these gospels. They might be doing the parables of Jesus and so forth. Well, eventually somebody, we call Mark, writes them down, and then the rest is history. The four Gospels, they're thoroughly Jewish because Jesus was a Jew and his earliest followers were Jews. So we have to kind of remember that. And remember I told the story of my rabbi friend who said, I just don't understand the Gospel of Mark. Where's the Christian stuff? Well, he got it. They're each written in Koine Greek, which is a kind of street Greek. It's not classical Greek. So if you had classical Greek in college, you could make your way through it, but there'd be some differences. Luke's the most sophisticated writer, and people always are like, well, what does that mean? Well, think of the difference between a freshman essay and the professor's article that's published. You look at it and you go, oh, these are different vocabularies, different styles of writing. And that's the way it is in Greek. It makes sense. They are all painfully aware, again, of the Roman occupation of the land. We call the first three, and I'll do it in the canonical order, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we call them synoptics. And you can hear in that word, seeing in a similar way, right? Optics, synthesized, but similar, not identical. It's just a way of setting it off over against John. When John comes along, he's not interested in doing it the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke did it. He's got his own way. But the first three, they kind of have a similar chronology, okay? And then I mentioned this just in passing last week, but I find it still interesting to my brain for some reason. For progressives, the Gospels are kind of make up more of the main calories than do the epistles of Paul. So in Judaism, for instance, if you ask a Jewish friend, you know, like, what do you think of the law as opposed to the prophets, these sections in the Hebrew Bible and in our Bible? Oh, there's no question. The Pentateuch is above the prophets, and the prophets are above the writings. A lot of Christians that I know would be like, what do you mean something's above something else? But for Jews, that's just totally settled. Well, I find that for progressives, the Gospels are the more go-to than Paul, but that for evangelicals, more go-to is in Paul. And in part, I think, because of the theology, but also in part because Gospels are narratives that you get to wrestle with. Paul says, I urge you therefore too. Well, that's very clear cut. And so you kind of see a difference between a progressive and an evangelical approach to Scripture. Okay, so thoughts or questions about that? It's just general stuff, but okay. Okay, so we mentioned this last week. Only Mark calls his work a gospel, but technically he doesn't call it a gospel because that's an Old English word. He calls his a Greek word that translates good news. Matthew calls his a book. We'll look at that next week. Luke calls his an account, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then John calls his a testimony. But over time, the term gospel can sometimes be used when it's lowercase. It means good news, but eventually it comes to be capitalized and refer to a book in the New Testament. So we have these four gospels, capital G. All right, so here we go. Luke. No other gospel writer has an introduction like this one, and it will not probably thrill your soul. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. I mean, you talk about the difference between Mark, who just plunges into John the Baptist and Jesus coming, and this, I mean, your English teacher would say, really, this is your opening? It's not very compelling.
This is a lawyer.
Yeah. It's a lawyer, Nancy said. Uh-huh.
I'm curious, what translation?
This is New Revised Standard. Yeah. So what do you notice besides that it's long and wordy and?
Seems like it was directed to Theophilus.
Yeah, it does seem like it, doesn't it?
It's also,
So you're reading somebody else's mail.
it's also not very exciting.
No, it's not very exciting.
It's not drawing you into the story. You
Not
have
yet,
to
it's
keep
not.
going.
No, he's got a kind of a defense of his methodology, right? He's setting the tone for, well, here's what qualifies me to write this, here's my methodology, but it's not very compelling, no, that's for sure.
It's sophisticated.
Do what? What?
Go ahead. I said it's sophisticated.
Sophisticated, yes. Remember, Luke's got the best Greek. It is sophisticated, you're right.
I think it's the compelling thing to me is it's been handed down to us from eyewitnesses.
Yes, it has been handed down from eyewitnesses. What were you
I
going
was
to say?
just back to since the many have done, who are the many that have done this?
Yeah,
Well, he also says it's an orderly account,
he does say it's an orderly account.
yeah, which implies that there are a lot of other accounts out there that are maybe not so orderly.
It could imply that. We'll have to look at that word orderly. Okay, so these prologues, like that one, were the norm among historians. So Josephus, for example, in my History of Antiquity's most excellent Epaphroditus, I have, I think, made sufficiently clear. Doesn't that not sound just like the Lucan one? It does, right? So clearly he's an educated, sophisticated writer. He stands in a line of historians who are going to use good grammar, beautiful syntax, thorough kind of methodology. But we also learn a lot about this gospel. Okay, so here's some takeaways. It's not exhaustive. It's addressed to Theophilus, which means in Greek, friend of God. Possibly, this is one theory, possibly a benefactor to Luke. This same person is addressed at the beginning of Acts. And so it's possible he is sort of dedicating this to Theophilus, who is supporting his ministry of writing this. That is one theory. Could be. Could be that the other theory is true as well, or is different. And the second one is that it might be a literary device, since it means friend of God, and all who read it then are friends of God, and here's this story that's to you, to hear. Could be even both, right? It could be this double entendre. It's labeled an account. Now, I say it's labeled an account. That's not the word Luke uses. He doesn't use English. So how do you translate this Greek word? Well, they just shows account, but some make an argument for a story or a narrative. Because clearly Luke's theology is, if you want to know what this Jesus movement is all about, the best way I got to tell you is with stories. Stories about him and stories by him that we call parables. So it's possible that instead of account, we might want the word narrative. Again, it's argued. He notes that it's been passed down to us, which means several things, but it also means the writer considers himself part of the community, includes himself, which he'll do, by the way, in his second volume, Acts, when he sometimes is going along and describing something, and then they did this, and then they did that, and then he all of a sudden says, and then we did this. And we're like, what? What'd you just do? You changed pronouns. And those are called, very technical term, the we passages. Right? The we passages. And each time Luke does one of those and shuts it off, the next one gets a little longer, and then a little longer, and then a little longer, and there's the theory that he's sort of getting you involved, bringing you on. Because it's not just then that the writer, but we, the reader, are part of the we. The writer's sources are written in the phrase set down and oral handed on to us. So he has access to some written something. We don't have a copy of that. Well, we do, but I'll tell you in a minute. But we also know he has these oral stories. And it's orderly, but that's not the best way to translate that as chronological. And there's a lot of conservative scholars who interpret that to mean here's the chronology, but that's not a good translation. Orderly in this sense was a rhetorical term meant to say he is saying I paid close attention to what order I wanted to put these in. Not bound by, well, then this happened, then this happened. Nobody knew that. Nobody knew that, at least not in that time. And it's more like when you put together a speech or a preacher puts together a sermon and says, I don't know, I wonder if this would make more sense to do this here than that. That's orderly. And so it's kind of an unfortunate use of the term, because for us, hearing the English orderly, we think, in a chronological order. And then it also seeks to confirm one's religious instruction. You know, it said that little phrase, in which we've been instructed. It's kind of the language of catechism. So there is this notion that this isn't just for the heck of it. This has some religious value to it. It's to affirm you in the faith that you've been raised and nurtured. Okay, so then Luke's sources. We know that he draws on two written sources. One of them we have. It's called Mark. It's called Mark. And the other one we don't have. But it's called Q. That's just the first letter in a German word for source. So when they came up with the theory, and it's pretty well a proven theory, as much as proven can be when you don't have it. When they came up with that, the German scholars said, there was another source. And so they used the German word Quell for source, and then they said, well, let's just abbreviate it, and they call it Q. So Matthew and Luke both have a copy of Mark, and they have a copy of Q. So I'll show you how it works. So sometimes Luke copies Mark word for word, just copies it word for word. Sometimes he copies Mark and makes little changes and revisions. That has to do with the audience, has to do with the vocabulary. Still other times, Luke and Matthew both depart from Mark, but they agree, and that's where you get this notion. There are word for word the same thing in sections that are not in Mark, but they agree. They weren't near each other, they didn't write at the same time, and so you sort of draw the conclusion, well, they had to have a source. Now, some conservatives say, no, that's the Holy Spirit, and it was dictated, but I don't buy that theory. If you have the same wording written by different people at different times, you sort of have to say, there must be another source. So that's what they've concluded. So when we read Luke, and this is really tricky, you kind of want to compare and contrast. If it occurs in Mark or Matthew, you want to look at that to see how are they different. It's not to harmonize. Remember we talked about that, a gospel smoothie, put it in the blender and you hit. We're not trying to harmonize. We're looking at, so Luke took a story from Mark, but he's changed this. Why has he done that? You don't try and resolve it. You just say, he's made a change. Or it's from Q, but Matthew and Luke don't do it the same way. Why would they do that? So it's more for comparison, contrast, than it is to try and resolve it or put them in the blender. And then we know that Luke has some stories that he got from something maybe written down or from oral tradition, but they're unique to Luke. So angel's message to Mary, who will bear Jesus. The Matthew version, they're the only two that have a birth story. It's Joseph. The temple in Jerusalem when Jesus was 12. It's only in Luke. The genealogy of Jesus, well, in Matthew, it's traced back to Abraham. Well, that's good because that's, Father Abraham. But for Luke, it's traced back to Adam, which says something about a universality of humanity. Not just the father of the Jews, but the father of humanity. He has a sermon on the plain instead of a sermon on the mount. And he even says he came down to an even place. And there's this image of, instead of being up, he's coming down to where the poor live, and kind of this notion of an even plain. He has parables that don't occur anywhere else. Good Samaritan, prodigal son, rich man, and Lazarus. Those first two are like best hits, right, of all time. And the road to Emmaus. Nobody would have the road to Emmaus story if it weren't for Luke.
You skipped over woes.
Oh, did I? Yeah, woes. So in Matthew, when he has the Beatitudes to begin the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are, that's it, except later in Matthew. But Luke in the Sermon on the Plain has the blessed are followed by woe to you, and he has these woes. Thanks for catching that. Okay, and then you have some stories that are unique to Luke and Matthew, like the birth of Jesus, variations of it, temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, Lord's Prayer, different versions, by the way. Parable of the wise and foolish builders. Remember the building on sand versus rock. The lost sheep parable. It's in both. And the lament over Jerusalem. But that doesn't happen in the others. So that's how you have the stories from Q. Okay, so characteristics of Luke. Luke, when he tells the birth story, has people break into song. Like the Sound of Music. I mean, it's just very unusual technique. It's beautiful and it's powerful, and there's been all kinds of beautiful pieces written because of that. But, as my son used to say when we would all sit down to watch The Sound of Music, oh my God, that's so unrealistic. Well, he wasn't into that. But if you like songs, they're in there in Luke. He's the only one that tells us Jesus begins his ministry at 30. So, that tradition that you've heard, you say, well, he's about 30. That's from Luke. He clearly says it, spells it out. Now, would I want to invest my entire retirement savings on that he was 30 years? No, but that's how Luke tells the story. He is a young adult, or in this case, a full-grown adult. He has a special focus on Jesus' Jewish heritage, as will Matthew. And in particular, the Sabbath, the synagogue, and the scriptures. Very early on, he makes it clear. It's one of the first things Jesus does, even before he calls disciples. He goes to the synagogue where he was raised on the Sabbath, and he reads the scriptures. So Luke's going to, from the very beginning, say, you have any questions about this character that's on the stage now, let me tell you how good a Jew he is, right? Keeps Sabbath, reads scriptures, goes to the synagogue. So you kind of know where you're headed. He has more meal stories than anybody. And you've probably heard me cite the famous line that on nearly every page in Luke's gospel, Jesus is either at a meal, going to a meal, or coming home from a meal. It's an old classic line. It's not literally true. I did try it one time. It's not literally true. But it's very close. Very close.
Say bigger pages.
Yeah, bigger pages. Yeah. Now, what's fascinating, though, is, I say fascinating. David May always says that, and I go, I don't know if that's fascinating. You may not think this is fascinating. In Luke, he eats with everybody. It's only in Luke that he eats with Pharisees. In the others, he'll eat with toll collectors, and he'll feed the multitudes out in the wilderness. So he eats with the dispossessed, the outcasts, etc., the people of the land. But in Luke, he also eats with Pharisees, and sometimes like in back-to-back. But there's just so many meal stories in the Gospel of Luke, which, of course, is what he ends with, the road to Emmaus. I mean, there's a little postscript after that, but it's his ending, is even the resurrected Jesus is going to eat a meal. In fact, the resurrected Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke, do you have anything to eat? I mean, that's pretty good. He loves to pair men and women. I didn't even begin to list how many times this happens, but it's in the Gospel and in Acts. When he tells a story about a man, remember Simeon's the guy who's waiting for the Messiah to be born. Anna's there. He does this over and over. In Acts, he'll have Aquila and Priscilla. He'll have Ananias and Sapphira. Or in the parables, he'll have a story about a shepherd loses one of his 100 sheep. Next story, a woman has 10 coins. He loves to do that. It's his way of being inclusive. It's his way of saying everyone belongs. He interestingly has Jesus as a prophet in the tradition of Elijah and Elisha. So if you don't remember their stories, you've got to go back and read 1 Kings. But there's echoes of raising a widow's son and feeding her and so forth. And so, and there's actual references made to those two prophets. So it's very much a tradition with him. And then he has the Holy Spirit, as do a lot of writers in the New Testament, but he has a unique phrase he uses. He uses the word dunamis, from which we get dynamite, power. For Luke, the Spirit is power. In fact, in Acts it says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses. And it's this force, that mighty wind and tongues of fire that comes at Pentecost. That's Luke's theology. It is a Cecil B. DeMille version of the Spirit. It's big, big. Or what we would say now, Steven Spielberg. But in John's theology, it's a comforter. He calls it the paraclete, or the one that comes alongside, and he breathes on them and says, receive the Spirit. So they have different theologies of the Spirit there. And then, nobody does this, but Luke, he has an extended travel narrative. So he follows Mark's blueprint, except in the middle of his gospel, he starts at 9:51, we're going to look at it in a second, and he starts him on the trip to Jerusalem. And he has this big travel section. And all kinds of stuff happens in the travels, but nobody else has this moment when Jesus turns and says, this is where we're going. It's not as pronounced in the others. He just ends up there. But Luke's got a travel story. And then, of course, I've already hinted at it, he writes a sequel. And the other, of course, do not. But this is what's shocking to people. He writes 1/4 of the New Testament in these 2 volumes. More by far than the Apostle Paul. And that's even if you include the disputed Pauline letters and say, yeah, those are Paul too. Not even close. And sometimes just with any Bible you have, you can do this. Just take any one of the documents, open it up to the beginning, get to the end, and look at how many pages you're holding. And it's kind of shocking, especially when you get to Paul, and you think, man, these are kind of long letters, Romans first. But you do the little pinch thing and you'll go, there's not much here. But you do with Luke, Acts. Of course, they're separated, but it's a totally different game. 1/4 of the New Testament. Okay. So let me pause there for a second before we dive into some key texts. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
When did they split Luke and Acts? When did that occur?
Well, it only occurs when they put a canon together, so that's in the 4th century. And they were caught because obviously it's a sequel, but you had to have the synoptics together because of how they're similar view. And then John's the last one. So, they knew that John was late in the chronology of it, but, I have seen people play with how the canon could be shaped differently. There's a lot of actually scholarship about all that, but yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate.
Why did they associate Luke with the physician?
Yeah, that's an old tradition that if you subscribe to the theory that the writer had been a historical figure in the time of Jesus, but it's a tradition that's kind of been debunked. I mean, I was playing golf with a physician recently. He goes, yeah, I love Luke because he was a physician. I go, well, Yeah, maybe, okay, whatever, but not really. Yeah.
I think when I've had these relatively, they seem long to me, discussions with evangelical Christians, they glom on, or they become very attached to a fact,
Uh-huh.
the age of 30. So based on my experience with words in your classes, I've always suggested that perhaps 30 is an adult.
Mm.
He didn't do this as a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't do this as a child. His ministry began as an adult.
Mm.
And so, is there anything in Luke that suggests 30 was just a reflection of adulthood?
Well, they wouldn't have considered, they would have, I mean, the average age that you lived to in those days was maybe 40. That was the average. So he wouldn't be a young adult, he'd be a full-grown adult, and they would consider adulthood more in the 13 to 14 range kind of thing. But there's a whole cottage industry of good scholars and bad scholars who play with numbers in the Bible, and they do all kinds of stuff. And some of it is legit, like the 666 of Revelation. It can get you somewhere, but some of it is very fanciful, kind of like the Ouija board I had in the 8th grade, you know. You could do anything with it, make it say, yeah, that girl likes you. You know? But I wouldn't put too much stock in it. I mean, there is some historical evidence that corroborates the birth of Jesus roughly in 4 BC, and that he died somewhere close to the late 20s, early 30s. I mean, the whole idea that he had, how long was his ministry?
Oh, we all know it's 3 years, right?
3 years.
3 years, right. But where'd we get that? It's not in Luke, it's not in Matthew, it's not in Mark, it's only in John. Well, we're not in John, we're in Luke, right? So, but if that's where it came constructed, that he was 30 and he died at 33. But you're combining 2 gospels, you're saying that I can count on this historically. I mean, you know, for a long time we've been saying 2,000 years ago. How long can you say that before you adjust that? I mean, we've been saying it forever. But in a way, we're coming up on the true, I guess, 20th anniversary. Yeah.
Did he have a target audience?
Well, he writes mostly for his church, and his church, in theory, was across the street from the synagogue. And because remember, they write after the 70s. Well, after 70 is when the church and the synagogue went their separate ways. The earliest Christians, followers of Jesus, let me put it that way, not Christians. The earliest followers of Jesus were Jewish. They met in the temple, they went to the synagogue, but they also were in these houses. After 70, there was a lot of finger pointing, and this was the beginning of, and I'm not going to focus on this, but the Gospels can be anti-Semitic at places. And that's because of the split that happened between the synagogue and the house churches. But he does write for his house church. Okay, so this is the second part, from Sunday to Monday. We're looking at the 4 Gospels in 2 ways. We're trying to read Luke on his own. We're doing it so far. We're going to look at it. But we're also trying to say, what could this say for us? So, just wanted to mention this source. It's a very good one. Remember, it's a tiny book. I held up the Markan one a couple weeks ago. The Luke one, same size. It's excellent. I mean, it's older, so there might be some dated scholarship, but nothing that's going to affect the real value of it. Okay, so we're going to look at the travel narrative. It's the center of Luke's gospel. And there is this whole theory that what's in the center and what's at the beginning and the end are the 3 key parts in a rhetorical piece from that period. I won't go into all the detail, but the center is worth noting. It's always worth noting. So this is 951 that I mentioned earlier. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. So you hear a kind of declaration. Luke says there was a moment when he turned his face to go to Jerusalem. So in Luke, and I put here synoptics, Jesus goes to Jerusalem at the end of his life. Okay, so let me insert a parenthesis here, because somebody will catch it. Well, didn't he go when he was a little boy? Yeah, he did. He went when he was 12. But the synoptics don't have him going to Jerusalem every year, which of course would have been prescribed for the high holy days. And so historically, would you say a good Jew probably did? Yes, but that's not the way they want to tell the story. The way the synoptics want to tell the story is he's not going near there until the end, when he goes to die, when he's killed by the Romans. John, on the other hand, is going to have him go every year. There's all these festivals he goes to. Well, I mean, you've got the difference between what happened historically and what they're writing about. It's not a conflict. It's just the way they want to tell the story, which, remember, in this case is orderly. He decides what order he wants to tell stuff. But the idea is that it's a building tension. Okay, this is funny because if you read it, you go, well, yep, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. It is very hard to figure out where it stops. And there's like 3 places where scholars go, well, I think that'd be the end of the travel narrative. Well, it doesn't really matter, and I'll show you why. He's not a very good traveler. Last summer, we drove to Colorado, and our 5-year-old at the time grandson, like we got 2 hours away. We stopped at a rest stop in Kansas, and we had lunch. We drove 4 hours. We stopped at a rest stop in Kansas to get out and run around. And when he looked up, he said, "We're here again after all that?" Which was the best line ever. It was almost as good as the line when we got to Denver, and he said, "What language do they speak here?" I mean, he felt like we'd gone around the world. It was his first road trip. Well, for Jesus, it's kind of like, we're at the same rest stop. If you traced it out, if you tried to map it out, you go, man, they don't know how to get to Jerusalem. Well, it's a literary device that Luke wants to have us travel. Why does Luke want to have us travel? Well, it's his theology, and we'll look at it in just a second. Remember, orderly doesn't imply chronology, but here's what I think it's all about. Then and now. It implies different people, different cultures. And that's still the same world we live in, right? I mean, Rick Steves says the best antidote to xenophobia is travel. Become the minority in that place and you realize, oh, that's how people where I live feel when they're visiting or when they immigrate or whatever. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that very well, but the orange section there at the top of Israel is Galilee. It's technically the Galilee. And early in Luke, that's where his ministry happens. Now, he's not born there, according to Luke. He's born in Bethlehem, which is down in Judea, although there has been archaeological evidence that there was another Bethlehem in the Galilee. And some people say that's where he was really born. It would make sense, because honestly, that is a crazy distance to travel, especially a pregnant woman. Although, in Luke, she is not great with child when she arrives. She's just pregnant. Doesn't say anything about how pregnant she is. Now, he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. Well, you see that orange section where it says Galilee, and then you see Samaria, and then you see Judea? Or if you prefer, picture Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas. Now, I know you're going to say, well, you can get there without going through Missouri. Well, yeah, you can, but who would do that? I mean, I-35 is pretty convenient, right? You come down. Well, there's a little thing called the Mediterranean Sea over here. There's the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan. But there were Jews who actually would cross over into Jordan and go down because they didn't want to go through Samaria. And then Jesus will end up in Jerusalem of Judea. Luke's concern here is a theology of geography. It's not just, well, you know, he pulled off the road here and he stopped there. He's telling you about different people groups who have different views on different things. So, okay. There was that first little verse. Here's the rest of it. And he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered the village of the Samaritans to make ready for him, but they did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Well, of course. But he turned and rebuked them. Then they went on to another village. Clearly, this trip is going to have tensions of these groups. Samaritans are Jews, but they're half-Jews. They were Jewish persons who in the exile were not carted off and who intermarried. And they have a temple, they have their own Hebrew Bible, they just had different theologies about geography. That, remember the woman at the well, she says, well, we worship in and you worship, this is what was the tension. There was this tension, that's the word. Okay, so, xenophobia, fear of the stranger, and Luke's solution of an inclusion will be a focus of the journey. It's not the only one. I don't want you to think that the whole journey is just about that. I'm just selecting a few passages to give you a flavor of what's going on. And I think we can do the first one without even reading the text. This parable, by the way, is not called the Good Samaritan. It's not called anything. If you were to name it, you'd say a traveler went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, because that's the first line. And what happens? He falls among thieves, they beat him, they strip him, they leave him for dead. And now Jesus, who gets to make this story up, says, and there just happened to be a priest. And he passes by on the other side. There just happened to be a Levite, passes by on the other side. And then there happened to be a Samaritan, and you're like, whoa, well, this guy's up to no good. He's probably going to see if he's got anything left to steal or whatever. And he ends up, of course, being the hero of the story. And the man to whom Jesus is telling this parable, a lawyer, not a good translation, an expert in the laws of Judaism or the Torah, doesn't even want to say the word when Jesus says, well, which one do you think was a neighbor? And he says, the one who showed him mercy. Go and do likewise. Go and live that way. Oh, thank you. So right away you have, and look where this is. It's in chapter 10, verse 25. 9:51 to 10:25. He's just set his face to go to Jerusalem. The disciples go in to prepare some hospitality, and the Samaritans are like, nope, not here. Keep on going, bud. And James and John say, you want us to call down fire? And now Jesus is going to tell this story. So this is very clearly about a kind of, it's really both ethnic and religious in nature. In chapter 14, do you remember this story where Jesus gets invited by a Pharisee to a dinner? And he's kind of a pain as a guest. I'm sure the guy regretted inviting him. He went to the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, and they were watching him. And just then there was a man who had dropsy, and Jesus asked the lawyers, the Pharisees there, is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not? It's very common in the Gospels that healing stories and Sabbath stories get combined. And it says, but they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him. And then Jesus said, if one of you has a child or an ox that's fallen into a well, will you not immediately pick him up on the Sabbath, get him out of the ditch? They didn't reply to this. So then he notices how the guests are choosing places of honor. And he says, when you're invited, he just sees this and says, when you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, don't sit at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished comes, and then you're kind of booted out down the road. And so he kind of goes into that, and he's picking on them. And he says, this verse 12, he says to the one who invited him, so he was picking on the guest, now he says to the one who invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, you shouldn't just invite your friends or your brother or your relatives or rich neighbors, but when you give a banquet, you should invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. I mean, by this point, he's like, whose idea was it to invite this guy? And then one of the dinner guests says, blessed, a beatitude, blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. And I've always pictured this as everybody going, oh, thank God, the moment's over. We're all toasting. Blessed is everyone who will eat bread. And then Jesus says, well, you know, he says, someone gave a great banquet and invited many. And this is the guy that goes out and says, hey, the time's come, let's go. And they all start making excuses. Well, you know, just got married. Well, you know, I've just signed up for this and that. And then he says, the master in the parable says, well, go out and tell everybody to come. And he says, there's still room. He says, well, go out and tell everybody, right? And then it says, for I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner. So we'll talk about that, but you have a parable that says you should invite everybody and go out and tell everybody's invited, and people make excuses. So somehow the outsider gets invited in, but the insider that said, I'm not coming, doesn't get the taste of it. So one of the things that I would say about the Gospel of Luke is definitely universality, inclusion. It's a big thing for him. But he's not consistent. Very few people are. Prodigal son. I used to do this with my classes in seminary. I'd say, let's see if we can reconstruct it. Excuse me. Everybody could reconstruct it. Just throw out any line that you know. Any line. Anything that happens.
They killed the fatted calf.
Mm-hmm.
The older brother complaining about the younger brother's return.
Mm-hmm.
Eat the pods of the pigs.
Yep.
And what my inheritance.
Yep. Yeah, so we kind of have it in reverse order, but you hear it, right? You know the plot. So then I would ask, and what's the setting for telling this parable? How does Luke, in his orderly thing, where's he going to put it, and what's happening when he puts it? Because it matters. I mean, it's intentional. Anybody remember? So, it's chapter 15. Jesus is seen by the Pharisees going to eat with tax collectors and sinners. And they say to the disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And then Jesus responds and says, let me tell you a parable. And he tells three. He tells one about a shepherd. Remember, we referenced this one. 100 sheep, one's missing, finds it, has a party. Second one, woman, 10 coins, she loses one, she finds it, she has a party. Third one, there's a father, has 2 sons, loses him, gets him back, has a party. So you should by then say, I think I'm starting to get the hang of this. If something's been lost and found, it's worth celebrating. So Jesus says, that's why I eat with tax collectors and sinners. And of course, tax collectors had betrayed the Romans. Sinners just mean people who didn't keep kosher, didn't keep Sabbath, they didn't keep the law. So Jesus is setting this up. But you see, you have these notions of insider, outsider. The parable ends when the dad says to the older brother, hey, look, we had to celebrate, but you can come in too. And that's how it ends. He just on the porch. And then you have the rich man and Lazarus. I'm not going to go into it because I want to kind of move forward, but this rich man has a beggar at his gates. There's a reversal in the afterlife. So you have all these kind of ethnic, religious measures of purity, wealth, and status. All of these are in that travel narrative of what does it mean to be inclusive? What does it mean to travel? I'll just really quickly point this out. What Luke does in Acts is reverse it. Remember, he says, you'll receive the Spirit, this power, and it'll come upon you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, that's the city, Judea, that's that area, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So what Luke's done is make travel important because he's got a second volume, which is full of travel. Eventually, Paul going all over the Mediterranean. So it's like Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and now everything goes out into the world. So again, it's his universality kind of thing. Luke's, I'm going to skip that because I want to get to this. Okay. New Testament scholar Christopher Stendhal warned against playing Bible land. That's what he called it. Getting stuck in the ancient text, talking about inclusion in Luke and Acts, but not our day. So the thing that I continue to read about, know more about than I do about Ukraine and Russia, is the Jewish-Palestinian tensions in the Holy Land, which just so happened to be in the land in which Jesus lived and Luke wrote. So at present, this is going to be so big picture, but Palestinians are confined mostly to these two geographic locations. And if you've heard this but you never got a clear picture, you can see the Gaza Strip. It's against the Mediterranean, and it is a strip that goes against Egypt there at the bottom, but it is an isolated little strip. And you've heard during the war how they've gone up and down because there were bombings in the north, and now we're going to bomb in the south, and et cetera. But the bigger area is the West Bank, and people go, why is it called the West Bank? Well, because it's the west bank of the Jordan River, that's almost invisible here, but it's emptying down into the Dead Sea. So it's on the West Bank. And you'll notice that Jerusalem is in the West Bank, sort of. East Jerusalem is in the West Bank. West Jerusalem is not. This is why Jerusalem is such a tense city to live in. There's no border crossing there. In fact, every trip I've been on, we drive across it all the time. We just drove from West into East Jerusalem. Well, you went from Jewish into Palestinian. And there's some prejudice. If you tell your guide, hey, in Jerusalem, we're staying in East Jerusalem, he or she might say, ooh, East Jerusalem, are you sure? Well, yeah, we're sure. We want to, spread the wealth. We're doing things with Jews, we're doing things with Palestinians, we want to help them. Well, Palestinians see these as open-air prisons. They feel like they are living in prison. And there are walls, and they can't freely travel. Some of them could for work, but that's been shut down. Some Israelis favor that system, some favor removing all Palestinians. Most Israelis favor a two-state solution, that we share the land, Palestinians and Israelis will share the land. They can't come to an agreement on that for various reasons, but and 70% in the most recent poll of Israelis favor a ceasefire. So, but unfortunately, that's not where Netanyahu is. I love this book by Ari Shavit. 2 words, he says, intimidation and occupation. So the left, and you see this every day in the news, stresses Israel's immoral occupation of Palestinian land. The university sit-ins and protests on the left they say, how can the Jews occupy land that belongs to the Palestinians? But on the right, they lift up Arab intimidation and violence that has been enacted, like October 7th Music Festival. And they say, toward Israel through the centuries. And so the two sides, left and right, have picked sides instead of acknowledging the truth, which usually is somewhere in the middle. Nancy told me about this book when she heard an interview with the author, and I think it's one of the best things I've read. He didn't call it being Jewish after the October 7th, because he said, then you would only be favoring how we are victims. But October 7th, they were victims. October whatever, call it the 8th, they were no longer victims. They were going to be on the warpath. So Beinart quotes the American Jewish Committee, that this is the literature you would find on their website. God promises the land to Abraham, that's in Genesis. Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, that's in Exodus. Jews rule over the land of Israel in the form of judges and kings. Those are books in the Old Testament. But he says, noticeably absent is the mention of the book of Joshua, in which the way Israel takes the land is by killing. And supposedly, because God said to kill all of the people, including some animals. So the briefest of a history, God gives Abraham and his descendants a promised land of their own, Book of Joshua portrays that, again, as violent, killing all the inhabitants. But besides the biblical claim, what really happens in history, in 1948, which is only a few years removed from the Holocaust, right? The UN declares and recognizes the state of Israel. And Israelis who've just been through the Holocaust and who have been scattered in the diaspora forever, it seems, they're like, oh my gosh, we can go back to the land that was promised and that the UN now recognizes and the US totally supported. But the Palestinian view is based on, but it was our land. And your text even says that you took it by killing us. And so why couldn't we at the very least share it as opposed to you taking it? And there's horrific stories of how it was taken, just like there are horrific stories of what happened at the concert when Hamas attacked. So Israel definitely has been a victim of suffering. Holocaust is the supreme example, even though there's still deniers. I don't know how that's possible. But Palestinian factions, like Hamas, have resorted to violence at times, although most Palestinians most definitely want peace. They're in no power to fight as it is. And they don't particularly care for what Hamas has done. In fact, the October 7th really set back any cause of trying to be logical and peaceful about it. So here's Beinart's approach, which I call pro-humanitarian. The problem with our communal story is not that it acknowledges the crimes we have suffered. The problem is it ignores the crimes we commit. That's the kind of writer he is. He's just going to tell this kind of down-the-middle truth, that we have been victim, but we've also committed crimes. And he's a very devoted Jew who has been ostracized by many Jews for writing the book. The Israelis who were made refugees on October 7th should be allowed to go home, and the Palestinians who were made refugees in 1948 should be allowed to go home. So you can tell he's a pretty balanced writer.
In my heart, is he Jewish?
Yes, yes, he is. Okay, I just want to really quickly give you a little frame here. Even under the two-state solution, that both can live there, America has a pro-Israeli bias by tradition, and this is pretty much true on both sides of the aisle. It's fascinating, though, where it comes from. Partly it comes from a kind of anti-Muslim bias in a Judeo-Christian country, but something else. And I cannot go into all the detail of it, but it stems from Christian dispensationalism, which is this theory of how to read the book of Revelation that basically says the future totally depends on the Jews returning to the land, etc. And that's just one read of that text. But and if you ask a senator or a congressperson, what do you know about dispensationalism? They probably don't know, but that has been in the water and the air that Americans breathe. It's an old teaching. It's an ironic bias, given that evangelicals think Jews must accept Jesus or won't make it into heaven. So it's kind of an interesting bias. At present, universities with pro-Palestinian demonstrations risk losing funding, and I'll show you something about that in just a second. Beinart offers a different approach. He says the best way to convince Jewish students that their safety does not require Jewish supremacy is not to stigmatize them, it's to talk to them. So you can see there that he's got a real sound approach. Today, on his blog, he said, what if universities were investigated for anti-Palestinianism? So, you know, it's like this friend of mine says, the truth's usually somewhere in the middle. And what they're trying to do here is hold these two things together. Are there anti-Semitic views being espoused under a free speech? Well, of course there are. And there are anti-Palestinian views being espoused in a free speech society. But what he's advocating for is, let's have the free speech and let's acknowledge where both sides have been victim and where both sides have been attackers. So I just had one last thing. Like Luke, how might we advocate on behalf of all, especially outsiders? Unlike Luke, how might including outsiders still include insiders? And what responsibility do winners of the genetic lottery have for those not so lucky? You know, I did say to my class at Jewel, we were trying to talk about Israel, Palestine. They knew nothing about it. Nothing. One person had heard of it. I said, what would you, I said, do you know why you are not in Gaza in the arms of a Palestinian woman who's trying to get away from the bombs? And they were like, what are you asking? And I said, do you know why you're not one of those people? And I said, you're just lucky. You're just lucky. You were born here. But what's your obligation, having been born here, to people who weren't so lucky? And I think Scripture is pretty clear on that we have an obligation. So anyway, sorry I crammed so much in and had to hurry. What thoughts or questions, comments do you have? Or there's a lot covered.
My struggle always comes with people wanting to look at the Bible and say, whether they're looking at the Old Testament or New Testament, this is what we are told to do, rather than this is a pathway to freedom and concern and Jesus' love for everybody. I don't know how to get people off that railroad track that's going one way, and my observation, not a good place.
Yeah. Well, I don't know the answer to that one either. I mean, obviously I have a bias toward education, right? I'm an educator, and you know, some people's exposure to theories and stuff is different than somebody else's, and they become influenced by that, and it becomes their worldview. But education's always supposed to stretch you. It's supposed to stretch your worldview. You might still hold to what you held to, but you at least had to wrestle with the questions. So you could hope for that. That's all I know. I mean, I have those conversations on the golf course, and you know, there's 4 hours of walking, and you're talking, and I'll just kind of ask just the tiniest little push, in which they go, really? I never even heard that, whatever that might be. Mm-hmm.
That's when I was rereading The Lemon Tree recently, where it talks about the Jewish people coming in 1948, and the part they don't talk about in that book they do, but generally, is that they just took over the homes of Palestinians who were forced to leave.
Yes.
Well, I think, and the excuse is this was our land. And I kind of wanted to say to people who think that that's the overriding thing, well, what if the indigenous Americans tried to come and take back your house, move into your house, because that was their land,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It is a good analogy. That book, by the way, The Lemon Tree, if you don't want to read, you know, a Jewish scholar's whatever, The Lemon Tree is a story. And it is a story of two people and their families, 1948, and when that Jewish family comes and the Palestinian comes back to visit and they become friends. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. It's a narrative, it's storytelling, it's very compelling,
true.
and it's a true story, and you will say, oh my God, you see. And they wrestle with that middle. They really do. Mm-hmm.
Children of the Stone is the
Yeah.
next one that he wrote, which
Yes.
is also just amazing.
Yeah, Sandy Tolan is the author. Well, thank you so much for being here. Next week, Matthew.